As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. What would you do if an experience you'd long dreamed of was not only not what it's cracked up to be, but at times miserable? Would you own up to the challenges or pretend it's as great as you imagined? In her new memoir, One Bad Mother, Megan Williams chooses to share the vulnerable, messy, and at times ugly truths about what we want, how trauma impacts the way we see our dreams, and the tests that truly matter. During our conversation, we explore the challenges of being vulnerable on the page, the realities of modern motherhood no one wants to talk about, and a key book launch lesson every author needs to know on this week's episode of the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Let's dive in. In memoir, every scene should move your story forward, but it can be difficult to figure out which scenes belong, let alone how to frame them when writing about trauma and other tough topics. How do you know which details are essential to your story and which ones will just overwhelm readers? And just as important, how do you write these scenes without triggering yourself? These are common questions that can be so tough to answer. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman on October 16th to teach Mastering Trauma Scenes to Improve Your Memoir. During this webinar, you'll learn the difference between trauma, crisis, and rising action, how a scene's position in your manuscript will determine which details matter, and how to slant your material so that it propels your story forward. You'll leave with a deeper understanding of your story, confidence in your ability to add tough scenes to your memoir, and tools that will help you care for your readers and yourself. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. That's right, $25. For that price, you'll get access to the webinar, a workbook filled with tips and tricks, a copy of the recording, and a copy of the comprehensive Q&A. So if you want to craft a story that hooks readers and keeps them glued to your memoir, join me on October 16th for Mastering Trauma Scenes to Improve Your Memoir. The link is in the show notes. Why, hello, Megan. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. It is so good to see you today.
It's awesome to see you too, Lisa. You're looking fabulous as always.
Well, thank you. I can say the same. I love this color on you.
Thank
You know what? I think it's a color that goes well with your book cover for One Bad Mother.
Thank you.
Nice coordination.
It wasn't purposeful.
Well, it works anyway. And, I'm really excited about this because you are launching this book in the world, and you and I have been walking this journey together for a while.
Yes, I think I can honestly say I never thought that this book would see the light of day.
And yet here we are.
We
So
are.
what would you like us to know about One Bad Mother?
I would like to say that this is really a story of conquering disappointment on multiple levels. One was, it's the story of me going through the police academy and my gradual kind of reconciliation with that process. And that's braided into the narrative of motherhood and being disappointed by kind of the lack of cultural support surrounding me.
Yeah.
And so there's that kind of professional disappointment. And then on the other side, I returned to this book after another book I had kind of stalled in contract negotiation. And I was just devastated.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do. And I didn't want to write anything new. I felt like I had two books that I needed to get off the table before I generated anything new. So I went back to this, and as I looked at it, I thought, you know what? I actually kind of like this manuscript now, which is always a wonderful feeling because it doesn't always go that way.
Right. And I love that you took some time away from it, and it was that distance in conjunction with an inner knowing, like, I have these two books. I want to get them out in the world. I don't have the headspace to write something new until I get some resolution on this process, allowed you to come back and see this in a different way. And, I read an early draft, not the entire book, but an excerpt from it when we were at the Writers Hotel together back in 2019.
Uh, yes, yes. And I remember one of the comments in that was, you need to be more vulnerable.
Mm.
And man, did I not like that comment.
Tell us
Because
a little more.
I needed to show more of myself and what I wanted, and I just wasn't there in 2019.
Mm.
I didn't want to. And my reaction in the conference was I felt like very defensive. And, 30 years of therapy has made me able to label my emotions. And I thought, I don't want to. I am showing myself. Like there was that
Mhm.
little child bratty,
Yeah.
and I recognized it. And then when I came back to it, 5 years later, I realized I wasn't vulnerable and I needed to make it more vulnerable.
How did you get yourself to be more vulnerable on the page when you'd had this resistance?
I think distance helps a lot. I also,
Mhm.
when I write, I'm a deeply shy person, or I was when I was growing up, so I don't like really talking to people a lot. I do now, but I can only write if I imagine no one is ever going to read it.
Mm, I love that.
So I am trying to, like, I imagine myself writing to myself when I'm 80, and I can't remember all the exact details, but I want to, it's like a photograph to myself in the future.
Yeah. I love that frame because I often talk to people about who is your reader, and having some sort of avatar for the person sitting across from you who needs this book or who you're writing to. And I love that you're writing to this 80-year-old version of yourself so that you can remember this time and all of the complex things that were going on as you navigated these many tests.
Right. And one thing that really I do feel like gets in the way of writing is when I start to, when the people I think about reading this start to creep in. Like I think of, oh, what
Mhm.
if when my kids read this, what if they have shown zero interest in reading it, to be clear. That's when I start to kind of, it stalls my writing
Mm.
process.
Mhm. How'd you get over that hump knowing that your book's getting ready to come out? So at some point, you knew you were doing edits to a book that was in the process of being published.
I think I was completely in denial. Completely in denial. I just think I just didn't even think about it. It always was just me and my book. It's funny because I was actually talking in therapy yesterday about this. I had this expectation that I would make myself vulnerable and then all the trauma of the past would be gone.
Mm.
And, that I would write it into the past. And only in the last couple of weeks has that like uneasiness started to seep in. And my
Mhm.
therapist was like, you're joking, right? You understand that that's not the way life works, that like you can just shove it into the past and move on.
Right.
And I was like, but I keep getting reminded of it, of all of these little, micro traumas raising, my kids were really sick, raising them that I couldn't deal with in the moment, but that are just kind of seeping back in as
Mhm.
this like low level ickiness, I guess I would describe it. And I just have to I live with that.
Yeah, that can be one of the biggest challenges about beginning to publish, especially, I mean, I think it can happen for any book, but especially your debut where you've never gone through this part. This is a brand new experience, is that there is a great sense of vulnerability in being seen and putting your work out there. And so, yeah, all of the creepy crawlies inside us get to like come out and play.
It's like that imposter syndrome craziness. And I wrote a piece actually on that called Night Terror. And I just feel like part of me, there's the little kid who says inside, I don't deserve to be here. And then there's the adult who says, yes, you do. And those are warring.
Yeah, and what are you doing to navigate the war and to keep from, this core part of you that is doing this process to keep from getting hit with friendly fire?
The friendly fire is a great term. That would be a really good short story, Lisa, or essay. I am just, you noticed one of the chapters in my book called Breathing Room
Yeah.
as being a pivotal moment. And I hadn't ever recognized that. It was such a good observation. But I think that I am just taking time to breathe, just like breathe into the feeling and feeling it in
Yeah.
my body.
The breath is so important. And I'm glad that you're taking time to do that because the more you can breathe into it, the more it'll flow through you rather than getting stuck inside.
Right. And I'm realizing that a lot of these incidences that I talk about in the book, I have not fully processed.
Mm.
And it is a gift to be able to go back to them now on the other side, but it doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah. I don't know if some of these things do get easier. I mean, I don't want to give away what's in your book, but you write about some incredibly powerful moments in your life and you write about them with great honesty. And there's a rawness at times around what happened. And this book, when I read the first drafts, like these early iterations, it was very much, this police story and the motherhood piece was there. It wasn't like it wasn't there, but it feels like you have braided these together in a stronger, clearer way, and that one of the vehicles you're using to kind of move the story forward is this concept of tests. So how did you figure all that out?
So honestly, my husband came up with the idea of a test because we were running one day and I said, I don't know how to tell the story of, people say write your truth. Well, I wrote
Mhm.
my way into my truth by writing the police story and then realizing that the story I really wanted to tell was about being a mom.
Yeah.
And he was running and, we were racing each other. And he said, what about the idea of test? Because
Mhm.
you went to the police academy because you needed validation as a new mom, as a struggling writer. And the police academy, the test to get into it gave you that concrete pass fail.
Mhm.
And there's nothing like that in motherhood. There is no test for motherhood, just like there's no test in life to be a good person. And that was what was so kind of gutting to me is we live in a culture that was telling me as a mom, don't use plastics, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this,
Mhm.
giving me no positive feedback
Yeah.
on how hard I was struggling and even no, daycare, no cultural support. And this was really became the story of me finding that validation within myself.
Mhm. Yeah, it seemed like even though there are no external tests for motherhood, there was this internal test of, can I weather this? Do I want to do this? What does this mean for me? And I feel like there was this really beautiful exploration and breathing room for me was this pivot point because there was a certain tonal quality to the story and a certain lens through which it seemed like the story was being told. And then I felt physically this shift when we got there. Like I felt the breathing room.
Which is, I love that because I didn't even recognize it. And I was all week, I've been thinking about, you sent me these questions and I've been thinking about that and that chapter as a pivotal point. And it is really a
Mhm.
physical return to my body
Mhm.
where my son is really, really sick. He has pneumonia. And at the same time, the police department I'm going through the application process and they're kind of hounding me about how many drugs I did 30 years ago. And it's funny, but it took me to this moment where I had these two things and I was like, what's important here, Megan?
Mhm.
Get back to your body, get back to the breathing and really find out what's important. And so that you're right, it is a pivotal chapter. I didn't recognize that until you pointed it out.
Well, that was
Um,
the joy of having read some of it in the past and then also being an editor. And then I'm always like my mind is always thinking about all of these things and I love that. And I think at the line level, you write so beautifully. I mean, you have a PhD in English, so it's not a surprise that you have these skills,
Thank you.
but they definitely show up in this book. I'm curious to know what was the biggest surprise for you, either in the motherhood thread or the police department thread, as you were writing this, you went, oh my gosh, that?
So motherhood was just, I can't even like that's a 10-hour conversation, but I would say the biggest surprise with the police department was how obsessed they were with any candidate's past drug use.
Mm,
I had to take a polygraph, which I failed because for some reason it said I consort regularly with drug dealers. That was literally what they told me that it said. And they were obsessed with, the time I did mushrooms in 1990. And I just felt like of all the questions we could ask of police officers, no one was asking about alcohol use. Nobody
Mm.
cared if I had a prescription for OxyContin. I didn't,
Hmm.
but nobody cared if it was prescription, it was fine.
Yeah.
And so that was really shocking to me because I had been depressed in college and taken some, pretty heavy duty prescribed drugs. And
Hmm.
we had to do a PDQ, which is a personal disclosure thing, and write down everything we've ever taken as drugs and whatever. And they literally just crossed that page out and said, that's fine, these are prescription drugs. And I had thought, if anything's going to raise a red flag, it would be this.
Yeah, and I hope that now that we're so far into the opioid epidemic and we know more about how these drugs affect us, that they're caring now. But I loved that part of this of your book because it's not just this adventure story of like I go on this quest and these things happen. There's some really strong commentary on what people are focusing on and what's actually important.
Yeah, and that was eye-opening to me. Yeah, that was the biggest shock to me in the whole process.
Was there anything about the actual writing process that shocked you or surprised you?
I would say how easily once my husband suggested this frame of the test,
Mhm.
everything fell into place. It was like, okay, which is nice because it wasn't holding itself together.
That is always nice when that happens, and that's the magic. That's when you know you have figured it out, when you have some sort of aha and suddenly you're like, "Oh, this," and then you're like, "I'm done. Yes."
Yeah, I mean, the only problem I have is I hate it when people start a book with a dictionary
Mhm.
quotation, but I did because I wanted people to think about the many ways we use the question of a test, you
Yeah.
know. And I talk about that in the prologue or introduction, I think it's called. And I love first sentences. Like I've taught a whole class on first sentences. I love them. And the fact that my book doesn't start with, it starts with a dictionary quotation hurts me deeply as a writer, but it worked.
How did you know that it worked?
I sent it to my beta readers and they were like, this is great. This is what it needed.
Nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes getting that feedback from other people can help us have more confidence in what our books truly need, especially, when you have all of these skills, these different strategies, I'm putting this in air quotes if you're listening, the best practices. Sometimes what is right for your book isn't necessarily the best practice. It's what your book actually needs. And you were able to get that feedback. So, as you were thinking about this book, and we've talked a little bit about the police thread, you are so honest about modern motherhood, which I mean, I bow to any mother out there because it's rough. There is not a lot of support out there. And, the experiences you can get yourself into or find yourself in.
So I've been reading a lot on the psychology of this. There are a couple of really good books. Mom Rage is one, Ordinary Insanity is another, that talk about there's no other time in a woman's life. I think it's called, you would know better than me. It's called matrescence, how the term for the hormonal change and the identity change that happens to women when they become mothers. We have all this cultural time that we spend towards adolescence, but a woman has a baby and that's it.
Yeah.
There's no discussion of the grief that comes with leaving behind your former life.
Mhm.
And that was what was really stunning to me. I got really depressed when I was pregnant because I was like, what if I don't like it?
Mhm.
What if I don't like having kids? And I'm leaving behind I loved my single life in San Francisco. It was amazing. And I really grieved that life during the 7 months I was pregnant.
Yeah, there's no takesy backsies when you have kids.
No, no.
And yeah, and so that's I think a really important point is there's the grief of the life you had before because you are letting that go, whether motherhood is something you really want or something that is thrust upon you. But then there's the image of what you might expect motherhood to be like versus the realities that you face.
Well, it's a cultural construct, right? I mean, I tried to talk, this is actually one of the things that I did put more of in the book when I went back and
Mhm.
revised it with this frame is this cultural context of, I talk a lot about Mother's Day and this kind of saccharine
Yeah,
version of motherhood, which has absolutely no substance. But what it does allow is, mothers are ultimately the best unpaid labor force out there.
absolutely. I mean, the level of multitasking it takes, and it can't be said enough. There are some days when you just want to be able to go to the bathroom by
Yes.
yourself for 30 seconds, maybe a
Yes.
minute, if you can. And that can be a humbling experience for anyone. But I think it's also just, it illustrates the lack of support that we have in modern motherhood because, if you go back even a couple of generations, you would be around other women. You wouldn't be doing this alone. You would have a cohort of people, or you would have elders above you who would be navigating this with you.
Right. And not only that, is that our culture has created this internal control mechanism, whereas women don't talk to other women or very rarely
Mhm.
about how difficult motherhood is.
Yeah.
And my kids are like, they were reading my book. Well, they read the title and they said, "Well, do you hate being a mom?" And I said, "Absolutely not. I love being a mother. I love you as people." It's like the only analogy I can give to my kids is it's like having dogs. I don't always like cleaning up after them.
Yeah.
And you can't say that culturally about
Right.
motherhood. And there is a huge amount of criticism in our culture of women who are not mothering well. There's this idea
Mhm.
that there is only one way to mother.
I think that motherhood has changed. I mean, think about the Gen X mom.
Right.
The Gen X mom, the prototypical Gen X mom, smoking her cigarettes, watching her soaps, get out of the house, don't come back till the street lights come on, and then, you'll get some food. But in the middle of the day, learn to be a hunter and figure out
Right.
find those coins on the ground, search out the hose that has the water in it that you can survive off of. And
Right.
you're doing those kinds of things. And that was considered acceptable or decent motherhood because they were home and maybe they baked bread or something occasionally. But now, when I look at moms, I mean, there's a lot of pressure to make sure your kids are in all of these activities and you need to chauffeur them everywhere. Nobody was chauffeuring our generation.
No.
They were like, you have two legs.
And a bike, and you don't need a
Yeah.
helmet. Right.
Exactly. Yeah, you
Right.
have those things, you know, find your inner strength and go to that practice if you want to, but we're not coming with you and maybe we'll show up at the games. I think the good moms would like or good dads will like show up at the games, but practice, give me a break.
No, you got to get there yourself. Take the bus. I mean, I was taking the bus home, I think at 9. My kids, if I showed them
Yeah.
the bus at 9, would have like dissolved into a puddle.
And child protective services would have probably been called.
Right. I mean, yes, we are in an era of what I think psychologists call intensive motherhood, which takes a
Yes.
toll on your psyche because you can't, if your whole identity is wrapped up with making someone else's life better,
Mhm.
one, you can't do that. You can't ever make someone have a happy life. You can't take that, but it's a huge psychic responsibility.
Absolutely. And it sets you up for failure because there are so many aspects of motherhood that you can't control, including some of them that you write so beautifully about in your book. I mean, just even when your kids are born or how they're born or what happens directly after, it's not stuff you can necessarily control.
I said once to my OBGYN, like, I guess the kids were like 4. I said, I don't want another child because this was so traumatic, but I kind of I want to get pregnant again and give birth so I can know what it would be like to have a normal way, like a less traumatic.
Yeah.
And she said, she was like, yeah, that's not a very good reason to have a kid.
Yeah.
True. But yeah, it is a tough road. I mean, you see a kid and I have to stop myself from doing it. Like, even I say sometimes, "Oh, my husband was babysitting the kids." They're his kids. He
Mhm.
doesn't babysit them.
Right.
He's being a parent.
Mhm.
And when you have a kid, let's say a kid, we see all these stories who's left in a car and when it's too hot, the first question is, where's the mom? Where was the mother?
Yeah.
And that paralyzing feeling of it was just paralyzing of, I made a mistake, my kid is in danger, it's catastrophic. It's an awful, awful feeling.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that you bring into the book is that piece of vulnerability around how do I wrap my mind around these things that were outside your control, but yet society will look at, how is it in your control? And you figured out a way to navigate this beautifully so that, I'm going to be honest with you. When I started reading this book, I didn't expect us to get to where we get to. That was a nice, delightful surprise. I was like, oh, yeah, she pulls this off nicely. But I
Thank you.
wasn't like when we got there, I was like, I don't know where this is going, but it wasn't there. And yet, and
Good.
you do that. And I like that about the book because I always like to feel surprised. I mean, when you work as an editor, I'm constantly predicting where a book is going to go because that's just what my job is and I see those arcs. But you do a nice job of working through that. And you weren't sure this book was going to come out, and yet it is.
So I spent many, many years pitching to agents with you at the Writers Hotel.
That's true.
And I would get a lot of criticism of, this book would be better if you did X, this book would be better if you were
Mhm.
this. And when I went back to it, I decided to try a different route.
I know people who have published in all kinds of ways. And there's two learning curves when it comes to writing. There is the learning curve of learning how to write a book. And then there's the learning curve of learning how to launch a book into the world. And any writer who gets their book published has gone through that first gauntlet and made it to the end. But I've met so many writers who get to that point, pub date comes about, and they haven't really had the support from their publisher. They've not fully been educated on what's required of them, or sometimes they're relying on their publisher to do X, Y, and Z. And the realities are for most writers, unless you are, part of a small group of debuts, largely with the big presses, but could also be the smaller presses that get the lion's share of the resources. It's up to you to figure that out, and you have to make it all come together. So can you give us one thing to do and one thing not to do that you learned?
One thing I learned, they gave me a book stand and my
Mhm.
book to always have the product placement there. One thing I learned not to do, I would say, be nice and friendly and kind to
Mhm.
everyone who works in the bookstore.
Yes.
Know their names, know their history, because they put themselves on the line just as much as you do to have a book launch event.
Absolutely. And, the people who are at the bookstore are the ones who are going to recommend your book. And they're going to recommend books for people that they actually like, who have treated them well over other books. Well, I love that little secret tidbit. So, as we begin to wrap up, I always ask writers three lightning round questions. So, I'm going to ask them of you. What's the best piece of writing advice you've ever received?
So I took at another writers hotel. I'm doing a great plug for them today.
I know you are. It's like a little commercial.
I was a TA for Rick Moody, and he said to me, Megan, we all know you know how to write scene. Stop flexing.
Mm.
Stop writing just for the words and put the beautiful images on the page. You have to edit that out. And I was like, again, no, I don't want to. I like metaphor. I like this. But that was really good. Just take it down to its bare bones.
So, what I'm hearing you say is don't write a bunch of scenes for the sake of writing scenes or because it's something you love to do. Make sure that every scene counts
Yes.
and make it as lean as it possibly can be.
Yes. And it's really hard. I mean, this book was 100,000 words originally, and I think it's now 70, 60. I mean, it is pared down. And it's hard to, I mean, I have a file. I don't know, I should title it, my long lost friends, of things that I've taken and moved out of the book into this file, because
Mhm.
that's really hard.
Yeah, that is hard. And I think when you've worked really hard on something or you feel attached to, this is my strength. This is the thing that I'm really good at. And I love this scene. It's so hard to cut those darlings, but sometimes we have to. So I love that you have a file. And I hope that you use some of those things for essays that you're going to publish in support of your book launch or just, anecdotes that you might share.
I think I now have a file title, My Darlings.
There you go.
I love it.
So you're getting ready to be on a book launch. So when this airs, your book will have launched into the world and you will be on what we would call the book tour year, right? And that can look a lot of different ways for a lot of people. Maybe you're on podcasts, maybe you're doing guest blog posts. I mean, who knows? You're figuring that piece out. But it is a time of yes. I've talked to a lot of writers who are in that book launch year and they're trying to navigate, how do I do all of the things that I need to do and not always live with an empty cup? So, what are you doing right now in preparation for this time, which is going to be really intense?
I spend a lot of my time alone, but I also spend a lot of my time with animals, and nonverbal communication is pretty key to me. I
And you
have a
have a
horse.
horse.
I have a horse. I have, yeah, a horse that had a broken knee. I have two rescue mastiffs. I have a cat. And I find just being with animals helps you breathe.
Yes. I find that all the time with my cat, Miss Foxy. She likes to stand in front of me and just purr into my face. And there is something very delightful about that.
It is. It's heavenly. Yes.
And do you find, a lot of people commune with horses when they have them, that horse therapy is a whole form of therapy that's used. Do you find that to be really therapeutic?
It is, yes, and I actually used to volunteer to horse therapy. It's amazing place. It's like speaking another language
Yes.
because, some people say you put a bit in a horse's mouth and why would they like that? But they have to want to talk to you that way
Mhm.
and they have to let you.
Yes.
And it is just a way of communicating. I mean, like, so yesterday I went out and my horse had had all his shots the day
Mhm.
before and he wasn't feeling very good. And so I gave him, I said, Flint, here's a treat. And he looked at me like, Mom, my stomach really hurts. And all he had to do was look at me and I knew
Mhm.
that he didn't
That's
feel well. So we just walked around and just grazed.
nice. Well, I'm so glad that you have all of these animals, and I hope that as you are going off and doing, events, and then you're coming back, that you're just giving your horse a hug, giving your dogs a hug, giving your kids a hug, and giving yourself lots and lots of opportunities to breathe. If people want to buy your book, if they want to go out and get One Bad Mother, which has this beautiful cover, and I love that. It's a nice play on words. Where can they go buy your book? And if they want to engage with you and connect with you, what are the best ways?
So you can buy my book anywhere that books are sold. I would suggest independent bookstore.
Yeah.
And if you want to engage with me, I have a website, Megan Williams Author. And you can also engage with me through the Sibling website. All the authors are siblingpress.com, I think it is. All the authors are on there with contact information.
Nice. And if you missed that, it will all be in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Megan. I am, again, just absolutely overjoyed. I am celebrating alongside you. I feel like this is part of my victory too, because we walked down, this path. And I do want to say thank you for putting me in your acknowledgments. When I came to that, I was like,
Still waiting for that airplane, Lisa. Still waiting to jump out of that airplane.
oh, we will be doing
With
that
you.
most definitely. And if we're in LA next year for AWP, that might be the perfect time.
Actually, maybe we should just sky jump into the convention.
There you go.
Skydive.
I love it. All right, so we're gonna be planning that, and
Excellent.
we'll try to figure out how we can get film footage, because now that we've said this and it's on a podcast and it's recorded, people are going to be expecting it.
I love it.
Well, thank you
Thank
so
you
much for
so
being
much.
on. Yes, thank you. That's it for today's episode. If you'd like to learn more about Megan and, most importantly, buy a copy of One Bad Mother, please see the show notes for this episode. If you're learning from or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's a free and easy way to support the podcast. You can also get the latest episodes delivered to your inbox by signing up for my Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of A Trauma Survivor's Guide to Writing the Tough Stuff. You can also follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, where you can leave a 5-star review. If you have questions for me, comments about the podcast, or questions or topics you'd like me to consider for the Writing Your Resilience podcast, please leave a comment on YouTube. I read them all, and I'd love to hear from you.